Okay, fantastic. So, Amanda, it's great to finally have you on the show.
Thanks, Josh. Fantastic to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Not a problem. So, you work with the Belfast Climate Commission. Do you want to give people a little idea of what sort of work you're doing with them, or what that organization is about, just to start off?
Yeah, absolutely, Josh. Thanks for that. So I'm an environmental sociologist by background with a previous background in community development, adult and community education. And I work in Queens as part of the Place-Based Climate Action Network. So we're a UK-wide network that is focused on supporting cities and communities to make the transition to a net zero carbon future and to take action at different levels of our communities and cities. So as part of PCAN, we're funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. I've been involved in setting up Belfast Climate Commission, which is focused on supporting the city to take the key steps necessary to make a transition to a more sustainable future. So within Belfast, we've set up our commission. It's been going for about a year and have set up various working groups focused on key areas of activity. And I chair the Community Climate Action Working Group of the Commission, which is focused on supporting communities to take action on climate and to become more sustainable. So that's kind of my main work. Alongside that, I also chair the Climate Coalition for Northern Ireland, which is a relatively new network focused on leading on climate legislation and policy for NI. So great to join you today. So bringing in these different hats and areas of work that I'm doing around climate.
So it's a pretty good day to be able to talk about this. It was either yesterday or the day before Boris announced his green industrial revolution. So is that a good positive step forward for us? Does that go far enough? Is it comprehensive enough in your mind?
I think it's definitely a good start. We need political action, we need resourcing, we need funding, we need attention to climate and sustainability on an ongoing basis. So to see the Prime Minister allocate additional funding to prioritise key action, I think, yeah, it's definitely a good, an important step. So the key thing is that it's this plan for this 10-step plan for a green industrial revolution, that it is achievable, that it is met with targets and supports for action at different levels across the UK. So it's not enough to have a lovely strategy on paper that will provide funding for some areas of activity. It has to be about recognising how that fits with devolved government, how that fits with action that happens at city level, that happens at community level, and all the rest. So yeah, a good start, but we have to see how that's going to be manifested in Northern Ireland and what actions are going to happen here before I get too excited about it anyway. Good to see, but a lot more to do.
So then to sort of move towards Northern Ireland, how green are we at the minute in Northern Ireland? Where are we along the path to carbon neutrality, or at least some sort of carbon reduction?
Yeah, well, we are improving. Our greenhouse gas emissions have been reducing based on baseline levels. We're doing better in relation to overall emissions are reducing, but we still have a key issue. For example, we have a larger percentage of methane emissions in Northern Ireland. That kind of reflects the dominance of agriculture. So agriculture is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in Northern Ireland. It's 27% of emissions. Energy supply is about 15%, transport 23%. So we have an issue, why we're seeing some reduction in emissions in areas such as business, energy supply overall, residential sector. We are seeing increases in agriculture and transport. So we are doing better, but we have a lot of work to do. I think over recent years, we're seeing more attention to the need for concentrated action to move towards a green economy. The department's working on a green growth strategy, which will hopefully help transition across different key sectors and key sectors that have a large emissions. But we're starting, we're in the right direction, but we have a lot of work to do to reduce our emissions to move towards a net zero carbon future for Northern Ireland.
No, I was talking to my mum last night actually about the new regulations. She was a little confused about. She was concerned about the electric car mandate, or at least the ban on sale of petrol and diesel cars. She said actually that she'd been confused about the way it had been presented, as if those cars were just going to be totally illegal from
Yeah.
2030, that you weren't going to be able to drive them at all. And I had to like reassure her, like, no, you're just not going to be able to buy a new one. But like, what would you say to people who feel like the state or the government or the executive just like handing down regulations for things that we need to do, say like you're gonna have to drive an electric car, whereas some people would say, okay, yeah, that like I'm happy to go green, but maybe I'd prefer action on like a community level, something that's gonna like benefit us instead of something that we're just being told we have to do that might seem like prohibitively expensive for a lot of people at the minute. Like she was like specifically concerned, for example, about the cost of an electric vehicle.
Yeah. Oh, I can completely understand. Sometimes we hear about these top-down measures, and it creates fears about how are we going to afford to do these, what impact it's going to have for our lives. When it comes to the sort of changes we need to make as a society, I think it's really important that there's work done with communities to explore what the issues are and to explore what our options are. To just announce policy measures without having to do work with communities around what are the main sources of emissions, how are we all contributing, I think that's a bit problematic. So to think about understanding how we live our lives, where the main source of greenhouse gas emissions come from, and what we can do, I think is a really important part to think about us individually and collectively making decisions to reduce our carbon footprint. So when it comes to electric vehicles, okay, great that that there's been some policy incentives to try and move towards less carbon intensive forms of private transport. But what about public transport? What about encouraging and providing support incentives for people to uptake more public transport, which will have a lower carbon footprint? But what about also supports for active travel? How do we make other forms of travel more attractive to private cars? Because let's bear in mind that when we talk about moving towards electric vehicles, the production of electric vehicles has quite a large ecological footprint as well. Where does the materials for those batteries come from? What are the impacts of cobalt and lithium generation and production in other countries? All that has a carbon footprint. So when we're thinking about these changes, for us to be able to understand what the consequences of these changes are so that we can make informed decisions, but recognizing that support has to be provided for people to make these decisions to reduce carbon footprint. So that support involves training, learning about these issues, but also then supports for people then to make proactive decisions to reduce their carbon footprint. So EVs are good. They're definitely an improvement on private car use which has large carbon footprint, but it's not the only answer. What about let's have hydrogen buses, let's have EV buses, let's have other forms of public transport which will help lower the carbon footprint of transport overall, alongside providing support for people to make these decisions themselves without being necessarily forced upon people. There has to be that meeting in the middle of bottom up of people making choices and change themselves alongside the top down incentives and policy changes.
So what measures have you, or like what programs have you either like taken part in, like run or kind of proposing or hoping to see done that would sort of make that kind of movement where you'd be bringing communities on board? For example, like is there some examples of programs you've either taken part in or sort of plan to do to get people on board for that kind of like transition of the economy?
Yeah, absolutely, Josh. So then Belfast Climate Commission, I suppose, to think about bringing the different levels together. In Belfast, we have just conducted a carbon roadmap for Belfast, looking at the main areas in which we can reduce collectively our emissions. So that's one strand of work happening on the Commission. Within the group that I chair, the Community Climate Action Working Group, we've done a bit of research with communities to look at what's already happening at a community level, what can we do to support communities to come together and undertake more actions. So that piece of work is already happening, but we're seeing great examples of what communities can do already. We're seeing examples of community gardens where people are growing their own food coming together. We're seeing examples of community-owned energy cooperatives where people are generating their own electricity through maybe it's solar photovoltaic panels on their homes to generate their own electricity, with solar thermal to generate hot water. We're seeing collectively owned PV photovoltaic panels owned by communities, wind turbines, and also other supports, community centres and homes putting in alternative heating systems such as air to water heat pump systems, which moves away from oil and gas for heating as well. So we can see that at a community up level, we're trying to support these sort of conversations. We've had events on community energy. We do educational initiatives with communities, workshops, etc., around what the issues are, what we can do about it. So that's what's part of what we're doing. We're hoping to expand that strand on support for communities at a local level, but we're also doing the work around trying to inform and help policymakers make these decisions about how, as we as a city, move towards a low carbon future. And for example, our research is emphasising the importance of energy efficiency. So importance of putting money into insulations in homes, to put money into changing heating systems. All those sort of things are really important. But we do need to bring those pieces together. It has to be analysis at the top level changes, but also around what communities can do, because we all have to be part of the solution. We can't leave any individuals or communities behind as we make a transition to a greener society and economy.
I mean, one of the critiques that I often hear of the climate movement generally is that they're not thinking of communities and of like just ordinary people, that they're just deciding that they're going to make these rules that are going to be too expensive for normal people to kind of get on board with or see the benefits of. So it's positive to see that like that's like a huge part of your work. I'm curious to go like slightly more into detail about a couple of things that you mentioned there. Actually, I wasn't aware that we had like that many community owned energy cooperatives in Northern Ireland. Where are they?
Well, they're spread across Northern Ireland. So the Northern Ireland Community Energy, NICE, is one of the main hubs for community energy. So if you go on their website, you can see a map of where there are community energy initiatives, and that's kind of spread across different parts of NI. Drumlin Wind Energy Co-op has supported the construction of wind turbines in Antrim and Armagh. And this is an evolving sector, and I suppose what's really valuable to point out is that we're seeing this evidence when people are coming together, and together we're going to lead on this. We're going to take matters into our own hands because we want to be part of the solution. We're not going to have this done to us. We're going to do this together with others. So it's an evolving area, but we're definitely seeing, this whole idea of energy democracy, where people are making decisions about how we contribute to energy generation, how we can help collectively reduce our carbon footprints by moving away from oil and gas and coal dependency.
I mean, the energy democracy thing is I think like so important, because especially with the absolute like chaotic and mad state of the world at the minute, like communities and just like Northern Ireland or the United Kingdom or Ireland as a whole being able to produce and rely on our own energy is such a boon for like our own just stability and ensured sort of future prosperity. And I think that's kind of lost on a lot of people. They don't realize like how beneficial it is to just be able to rely on what we can do here to generate our energy, instead of being at the whim or not maybe at the whim, but like at the mercy of the fluctuation of like the international oil or gas market, and the prices going up and down dependent on like foreign wars or what's happening in Saudi Arabia, or like to have our own like produced electricity is such a positive and like helpful thing for the nation. I think that kind of gets lost sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. And I suppose it's kind of understandable. We live in a very complex world. We're all very busy with work and family and home life and all the rest. And sometimes it's a bit hard to think about actually, where does the energy that is fueling my car come from? Where does that fuel come from? Where does the heat in my home, where does that come from? Those are big topics. And it's complex to think about, how does oil come from, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Norway, how does that come from a seabed to end up in my tank? So that's a complex topic to deal with. It's also complex to think about the power of the oil lobby, their connections in relationship to government. It's challenging to think a bit about the environmental destruction inherent to production of those resources, about the social conflicts associated with oil and gas extraction. And it's complex to think about the overall contribution of the oil and gas industry to climate breakdown. research from the Carbon Disclosure Project suggests that about, I think it was over 70% of companies are responsible for, over 100 fossil fuel companies are responsible for about 70% of emissions. So these are big things to think about. But I suppose one way to think about, without overwhelming people, is about actually, okay, I live in a world that's very dependent on oil and gas. We live in high carbon societies. But what can I do about that? How can I lower my own carbon footprint as an individual, within my family, within communities? And that whole thing of us taking power of energy is really empowering, that, we can generate our own electricity if we get the supports, because it is expensive to install solar photovoltaic panels. It's expensive to install air to water heat pump systems. But when we do that in our homes and in our communities, we're moving away from this global dependency, this network of energy production and consumption that has massive socioeconomic and ecological impacts, to something that is about local level, us taking ownership of our own energy and just our carbon footprint, with all the massive benefits that come with that.
I mean, I think it was there was a company in America, I think it was called Solar City, which I think is the company that Elon Musk ended up buying, and the program didn't continue. But there was one point where they were offering people like free solar panels or something, like super low cost solar panels that were paid for by a hedge fund or like a big financial firm, who were then getting paid back for the solar panel in part of the profits made from the energy that was generated. And it was like such a cool idea that people were going to be given like the ability to actually like put money in their own pocket, whilst at the same time like trying to be a little healthier towards the planet. Like it's a really inspiring concept.
Well, and that's it. There are so many opportunities for green economic activity and these sort of things, about creating new, whether it's larger scale energy projects or supporting communities, providing investment for that. I see with the finance sector, I think is increasingly paying attention to the value and green growth inherent to this transition that we need to make. We can see that in our PCAN network, colleagues in the London School of Economics have created a Finance and Just Transition Alliance, which is about bringing together investors to think about how to direct their funds into those sort of initiatives as well. So it's very exciting to see the change that are coming and the level of awareness that we're seeing across key domains for change.
So Northern Ireland actually also has in Ballymena, we've got I can't remember what the name of the company is, but they're making they're hoping to make a lot of hydrogen buses or hydrogen fuel ran buses. Is that like a something that's coming imminently, or is that like 10 years down the line?
Yeah, there's a number of projects involved in like B9 Energy, and Queen's is involved in some test centres to develop and some research on hydrogen buses. Okay. So that's really exciting initiatives happening there. I'm not sure about the timeframes because I'm not actively involved with those initiatives, unfortunately. But yeah, there are great things happening. And we see great partnerships between communities, universities, businesses, and investors that are about these key elements of hydrogen, solar generation, all these kind of key projects that we need as we move towards a green society and economy.
So what do you think the biggest resistance is that we're going to come up against in trying to make this transition happen in a way that's beneficial to everyone and is fast enough so that we don't sink?
Yeah, I suppose there's concerns across different domains. I mentioned earlier that I chair the Climate Coalition for Northern Ireland, and we've been working in partnership with legal experts and politicians over the last couple of months to draft the first climate change bill for Northern Ireland, and that climate bill is currently with the Speaker's office at the Assembly. But as we've developed our bill, so this bill is about providing the legislative framework in Northern Ireland to enable a just transition to net zero economy by 2045. And some of the concerns we're seeing is that how do we support farmers to make a transition? Because we know in Northern Ireland agriculture plays such a key role. So how do we help farmers make those transitions to different forms of production that will meet the needs of society, but will also ensure no communities left behind. So that's a key thing for us to think about is agriculture, to think about changes to energy generation. That we're looking at more localized production of renewable energies. How is that done in a way that is fair, that's inclusive, and that doesn't damage communities? I think we've seen a tendency in some parts to develop very large-scale wind turbine projects without the participation or consent of communities. So as we move towards different forms of energy generation, we have to ensure that communities are on board with electricity generation, that it's not something that's done to them, that energy generation is done with communities, whether it's communities generate their own electricity or work in a partnership with large developers to generate electricity. So I think we need to think about energy generation, we need to think about agriculture, we also need to think about changing transport systems to minimize overall carbon footprint and ecological footprint. So to think about infrastructure. So these are some of the issues that we're discussing within the Climate Coalition and within Belfast Climate Commission more broadly, to think about what are the ramifications of the changes that we need to make to go where we have to go to reduce our carbon footprints, to move towards a low carbon future. And so we haven't seen large resistance as yet, particularly within the coalition. We're being very conscious of trying to engage with key actors to ensure that everybody's voice is heard as we look at changing policy frameworks and bringing in climate action plans. But yeah, I think the key sectors, I think if we look at those, we can anticipate that there may be resistance in some of those areas.
So how would you bring do you have some ideas for policies or whatnot that would help farmers accept this transition?
Yeah, there's an interesting movement called the Nature Friendly Farming Network that are working on that area specifically. So I'm not an expert in agriculture, I'm not going to pretend to be, but there are those who are and who are publishing reports and advice to farmers about how do you become more nature friendly, how do you reduce your carbon footprint, how do we move away from large scale dependency on livestock production. What other alternatives are there for farmers, whether that's around growing foods with to respond to need for food, but don't necessarily entail the large carbon footprint that are associated with generating and producing animals for consumption. So there's networks out there, and there's people who specialize in those areas that are providing advice to farmers about the options there. But I think we need more attention to that. We need attention on a policy framework, at an educational level, and around a finance level as well. How do we provide the practicalities for farmers to change away from intensive production patterns that are damaging the environment towards more sustainable processes in a way that brings people along with the change and not leaving communities behind or generate mass resistance. And there may, likely there will be resistance because we are deeply embedded in existing patterns of consumption, whether that's a consumption of dairy products and meat, of private transport, where we're so used to driving our own cars everywhere. All of these things have environmental change, consequences. How do we move away from those? That's going to take change at an individual level, within communities, within different sectors, but it's all possible. And actually, we need to make these changes if we want to have a healthy, sustainable planet for future generations and for our generations. Josh, we're already seeing the consequences of climate breakdown, and that's only set to accelerate as global temperatures increase.
I mean, I read The Uninhabitable Earth. I talked to Professor John Barry actually about it, about how really just terrifying it is when you read simply just the cost of what we've done or what we're experiencing now. Nothing, there's a lot of talk in the book about where we're going, but a lot of it is just trying to get us to understand the year-on-year cost of the increased extreme weather patterns that we're seeing at the minute, not even based on people's speculation or models or projections for what's coming in the next 10 to 15, 20 years. Yeah, it's pretty scary. But I think you make a good point there about trying to we're going to meet resistance in where people maybe stand to lose from a transition away from the system we have at the minute. Like I put this proposal to Kelly Armstrong, the Alliance MLA, like it must have been 3 years ago now, when I first started doing this podcast, that I had like just very slapdash put together about how cheap it would be to make it free for everyone in Northern Ireland to use public transport and to expand our public transport networks. And she was kind of a little bit dismissive of the idea, because I just wanted to get everyone to pay like a £200 pass, like as an example, and then you just use all the public transport for free. And like when you weighed up like the savings you would have in terms of like just how much less air pollution there would be, it would have been worth it. But I've discovered from talking to some people within TransLink that like to make any kind of movement you're gonna, or like change to their current setup, that you're gonna meet like serious resistance from just like, for example, like the people within TransLink who are resistant to any kind of like structural or like change or reorganization. Like, how do you think we're gonna combat those people who are resistant and stand to lose a lot? Like, how do you bring everyone along? Or is it literally a case of saying, like, we're going to explain the benefits to as many people as possible and hope that we get enough people on board to push forward with it?
There is a key role of explaining to people the benefits of making these changes, but there's also, as you referred to the conversation you had with John about explaining the reality, the consequences of what we're seeing. We can see in Northern Ireland the changes over the last couple of years, the flooding, the extreme weather events, all of those are showing the impacts that climate breakdown will have locally. But if we look at a global figure, as you're talking, it reminded me of research that came out last year that showed that in a 5-year period between 2013 and 2018, there were over 4,000 weather-related loss events recorded globally. Nearly 70,000 people died because of these weather events that were connected with changes to our climate and global temperatures. The economic cost of those events was estimated at $964 billion US. Yeah, so this is the reality of what we're seeing. What is happening on a global scale? What is the economic, what is the social consequences, ecological consequences of changes to our global temperatures and climate? And these are dramatic and absolutely devastating for those affected. So how do we have these critical conversations where we understand what we're doing has massive ramifications across the globe, but do it in a way that's not about terrifying people? Because you think with these figures, it gets really overwhelming. So how do we engage in these learning moments where we're exploring, these are the issues that are happening, these are some of the consequences, these are the benefits that will come if we create and work together to create a better, more sustainable future. So how do we tackle climate skepticism, climate denial, eco-anxiety, which is a real thing? People are feeling anxious about these events, to foster hope that, we can make a better world, because we can. We know that when we come together, we can make dramatic changes. We can see that through COVID, about how we as societies and communities were able to make changes necessary to try and slow down the spread of the virus. We can, to know that we're creating a better world, that in itself is a powerful motivator for people to bring about these changes. So yeah, I understand completely your point about resistance, about, these issues are massive, somewhat overwhelming, but how do we learn about these with a view towards making a better world together?
Well, I mean, hopefully we can. I get the feeling actually that the moment that we started like naming our storms, which I still think is just I can't explain to you enough how stupid I think that is. I think it's just a complete like Americanization of like the weather, and it's like a thing that they get to sell. It's like, oh, storm, Dorothy or whatever, and they get big headline. But I also think it might be like quite a significant moment in the fact that like storms of like a significant size and impact started to become so frequent or like significant enough in the every single winter or autumn that we started naming them, that there was enough justification for it, that we might see that like as a point where we like we didn't wake up, but like that might end up as like a significant little moment where like there was suddenly like a small realization of the consequences of yeah, like a warming planet and like a warming ocean, in terms of those storms coming off the Atlantic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a a good idea. And I think when we talk about understanding the causes of these storms and extreme weather events, about how do we adapt to the consequence of their frequency. So that's the whole thing about in climate action is mitigation, reducing our carbon emissions so that we're slowing the contribution of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and trying to limit temperature increases and weather events, but also then how do we adapt to the inevitable changes that are coming. So whenever we see sea level increases in Belfast or around the west coast, how do we deal with that? What flood defences are put in place? What strategies are there for communities to deal with rivers, banks busting in their area and flooding their homes? So all those has to be part of part of the solution as well, is about those adaptation measures. So again, without trying to overwhelm people, but if we're thinking about storms, is to make those connections between Storm Dorothy and what Storm Dorothy might mean for our local area, and what can we do about it in terms of how do we reduce our overall contribution to climate breakdown, but then how do we cope with the consequences of it?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, like it seems like I think we're at least moving in the right direction. Like, how much credit do you give to, say, movements like Extinction Rebellion over the last like few years in really pushing this forward as a thing that needs to be addressed? Because, like, if you told me 5 years ago, right, that like a really right-wing conservative government would be the people to declare a climate emergency, become the first like country in the world to like have their parliament or yeah, legislative body pass like a resolution that says we are in a climate emergency, and be one of the first to like pass or at least really start like legitimately pushing some kind of like Green New Deal or Green Industrial Revolution like we have now in Britain. We're like one of the first. I mean, this is not to pretend like we haven't like lagged on it for years. But like they're being one of the first governments to take like a really huge, like significant, like look at us, we're doing this, like it needs to be done, and we're gonna take the credit and pretend we're the first like to do anything about it. But at least like it's a big statement. And if you told me like a conservative government was going to do that 5 years ago, I would have called you totally insane. Like how much credit do you give to groups like Extinction Rebellion or say Greta Thunberg and the climate strikes, or how much do you think it is just kind of like people like actually realizing in their own self that perhaps like looking after the planet isn't an insane idea?
I think it's probably a combination of all these factors. If you think about the role of academia in doing this research and helping us understand these are the issues that we're facing, that groundswell of knowledge on these issues pretty has increased in recent years. I've been engaged in understanding climate breakdown for about 10 years now, and I see a massive difference in the amount of evidence that's available now, because we see that increase in evidence generation. But I do think that politically and socially, social movements have played a massive role in prompting this conversation about climate breakdown, about changing, about moving towards a better society. I was at a conference recently, or co-organised a conference recently on local climate practice, about bringing together research and action to inform climate action. And a colleague there from one of the UK English university said that their research with policymakers showed that Extinction Rebellion and school strikes, all these social pressures, was prompting them to take stronger action at a local authority level. And I think that's replicated at a government level as well. We see the power of these social movements that are saying, we need change. This is the evidence that's there for it. These are the actions that we need to undertake. So I don't think it's no one individual is changing our policy landscape. No one individual is changing our social movements and our societies, but it's a culmination of evidence, of research, of social movements coming together, and of growing political understanding and attention to these issues. that has been manifested now in things like the Boris' strategy and the policy framework we see happen on a local level. And I think it's really exciting because we are seeing a groundswell of understanding and of knowledge and of action around the climate and ecological crises. And we're also seeing, I think, greater willingness by political parties to address that. You're saying 5 years, we wouldn't have thought a Conservative government would have done this. You're right, we wouldn't have seen it. But we can also see within Northern Ireland, with our climate change bill, it has cross-community, cross-party support. So we've pretty much, nearly all the main political parties and independent MLAs have co-sponsored this bill. You wouldn't have seen that a couple of years ago. No. So it's really interesting how the dynamics have changed, how political dynamics, how social dynamics have changed locally, and nationally, and internationally.
Definitely, it's a positive move forward, at least. I mean, I used to think that they were so bought by the oil industry that there was no way they would do it. So that's at least a good move forwards. How much damage do you think things like RHI and then the recent kind of still unfolding cash for wind scandal that's going on, which is essentially, for people who don't know, it's essentially RHI, except not quite on the horrendous scale, and just based on wind turbine subsidies. But like, how much damage do you think things like that have done to people's opinion of the climate movement generally?
Yeah, it's very concerning when political decisions have impacts and can induce skepticism of something so important as the climate movement. I can't deny that RHI and the emerging scandal will cause concern, does cause concern, that state money has been used in ways that benefited some groups over others, that resulted in questionable use of public finances. But I hope that there's recognition that those changes don't represent the majority of viewpoints, don't represent what people want to see necessarily, and are a call for a critical reflection by politicians about what is needed to respond to the climate emergency, about what are the best strategies to move towards a low carbon future, and about if and when subsidies are considered, that it's not about benefiting a few at the expense of everybody else. Subsidies are used in an efficient way to support transition individually in communities, but at a societal level. But they're not done in a hidden way where we then see the scandal coming out about how public funds have been used and about how decisions have been made. Changes have to be done in a considered, measured way, but also in a very transparent way that brings people along. So I think it's an onus upon how politicians make decisions, about how policy is formed, about the need to engage wide range stakeholders in policy formation. But also that we can't allow those sort of decisions to affect the scale of change that is needed that can damage public support for change, because it's too important. We have to have everybody on board to move to to bring about the change that we need to move towards a more sustainable future.
I mean, yeah, the transparency thing is definitely important. I mean, one of the even amongst like, I don't want to lump the same people in. There's like people who are climate deniers, and then there's people who are concerned about what the measures will bring or mean. And like a lot of the concern there is coming from people thinking that I don't know, carbon budgets or stuff like that is going to be used to as like a metric or a way for like them to be controlled almost as like an arbitrary thing. So like the transparency thing is so important, so that you get everyone that like understands that there's no bad thing that can come from trying to build like a more sustainable economy that means that the world that we have experienced thus far as humans remains as such, and that we don't like trigger some kind of horrendous catastrophic warming that leaves us in a leaves us mired in either rising sea waters or untold numbers of climate refugees from drier parts of the world that are already experiencing drought. I mean, one of the things that John Barry actually brought up was that part of the reason for the Syrian civil war was drought, and that it's kind of overlooked often as one of the reasons that we saw like the civil war kick off, and then a lot of refugees like fleeing across the Mediterranean was the fact that there was a drought that was one of the triggers for the civil war, and therefore we could consider these people to be some of the first like climate refugees, which is it's kind of scary that we're already seeing that. But slightly more positively, there's some cool people talking about wanting to try and get a citizens' assembly on climate measures. Like, what do you make of that idea to kind of give it to the people essentially to decide what we would like to do about it?
I think citizen assemblies are fantastic. They're not the only answer, but they're certainly an important part of how do we engage everyday people in these sort of conversations. You know, the beauty of a citizen assembly is that you bring together a sample representative of our overall population. They come in, they have access to different forms of expertise and knowledge. They get to evaluate this different forms of evidence and make up their own decisions. So I think, we need a citizen assembly on climate action in Northern Ireland. But not just that, we need to have activities at a local level. So we can go to our local community centre in Ballymena or East Belfast, or we can go to somewhere in Oma, and we know that we can go in into a community centre, that there's information, there's access to this information, that we can engage in this as well. So let's have a citizen assembly, but let's also make climate education and training accessible to every community. Let's have information supports about what we can do accessible to every community. Let's have more supports for community action around generating electricity, about improving their own homes, energy home retrofits, energy efficiency. Let's do all of that. Let's have a suite of activities that engages our people at every step of the process. That's what we need to bring everybody on board.
Couldn't agree more. So how would you suggest that people get involved? Like, say someone is listening to this and goes, I'd like to look at more from Belfast Climate Coalition, or from or just like trying to find ways to maybe get their community more involved, or get more involved in community projects in their town, village, city, street, whatever. Like, where would you send them, and what would you suggest they do?
Thankfully now, Josh, there's an amazing array of groups and organisations and networks committed to climate action at different levels. So within Belfast Climate Commission, we have a website, Belfast Climate. You can do a search for it, you can find us. That shows about what we're doing at a local level within the city. We're part of this broader UK-wide network, Place-Based Climate Action Network, or PCAN. You do a search for PCAN cities, you can see what's happening in Leeds, London, Edinburgh, Surrey. All these cities are coming on board as part of our network. But if you want to get involved at a local level, there's so many organisations that are like umbrellas and supporting climate action. Friends of the Earth are setting up climate action groups. Extinction Rebellion have a number of groups they get involved in. We have the Climate Coalition Northern Ireland, which is a network of individuals and organisations committed to climate action. So there's all these opportunities for people to connect in these broader movements. We have at a local level then the community energy cooperatives, food networks, community gardens. There's so many ways that we can all get involved.
Okay, well, I will, if you want to send me some stuff, we'll link all of that in the description below. But Amanda, thanks. It was a pleasure. Educational, informative, hopefully not too terrifying.
Well, to end on a happy note, we have so much capacity as humans to bring about change. We owe it to ourselves, to our future generations, and to other species to make the change that are necessary. But we can do it. We know we have to do. Let's come together and decide what the actions we're going to take, and put pressure on policymakers and governments to provide the resource that we need to make the necessary changes. So thanks, Josh. Great to talk to you today.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's all within our grasp.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.